sesiones, quisiéramos darles una breve información acerca del programa que patrocina este evento.
¿Qué tal? Buenos días. Gracias por asistir desde el inicio, a los que están. Antes que nada, quiero agradecer a la Facultad de Psicología por recibirnos, y a los invitados también por asistir, a ustedes por mostrar tanto entusiasmo en este evento. El día de ayer tuvieron una participación bastante buena que realmente nos motiva para el día de hoy continuar. Tenemos grandes invitados, espero que puedan aprovechar las pláticas de todos ellos, y algunas pláticas van a ser en inglés. Si alguien tiene problemas, no se sienta inhibido en preguntar, podemos ayudarles para las pláticas que sean en inglés, que puedan manifestar las preguntas que tengan, ¿no? Todos están en la mejor disposición de platicar con ustedes, y que el idioma no sea una barrera, por favor. Creo que ayer se notó que eso no les impide a ninguno de ustedes desenvolverse, lo cual me da mucho gusto. Y bueno, voy a lo que nos concierne. Hay que agradecer al programa de la maestría, que fue quien puso los recursos para llevar a cabo este evento, y también lo que queremos, o la razón del evento, es promocionar el programa. El programa de maestría en ciencias tiene 3 sedes, nació en Neurobiología en Juriquilla, Querétaro, pero se añadieron sedes alternas, que una de ellas es Psicología y la otra es la FES Iztacala. La matrícula todavía en Psicología es reducida porque no se conoce mucho sobre el programa, y una de las ventajas del programa de Neurobiología es pues que tenemos ya experiencia en este campo, ya más de 20 años, y hay una plantilla de profesores y de investigadores bastante consolidada. Si a esto unamos la plantilla de Psicología y la plantilla de FES Iztacala, pues se hace un grupo de académicos bastante robusto, que les permite incidir en cualquier área del conocimiento de las neurociencias y de la neurobiología, con todas las herramientas que tenemos a su disposición. Entonces, pues como se imaginarán, el estudio principal es el sistema nervioso. Se estudia tanto la fisiología en condiciones normales como en condiciones patológicas. Un aspecto importante es que el programa de maestría es un programa de excelencia apoyado por CONACYT. ¿Qué significa eso? Que el proceso de selección cada vez se hace más duro, porque este ciclo tuvimos 300 solicitudes, y hay que presentar un examen de conocimientos y una entrevista. Entonces, pero la garantía es de que quienes queden seleccionados cuentan con una beca garantizada para desarrollar todo el programa, sea en Psicología, sea en Neurobiología o sea en Iztacala. Lo que les comentaba, al estar las 3 sedes, contamos con facilidades de todo tipo, técnicas que nos permiten desarrollar proyectos. Otro aspecto importante de la maestría es que se les da, al ser un programa de excelencia, se les da apoyo o hay la flexibilidad para que al término o antes del término de su maestría tenga la oportunidad de asistir a congresos internacionales apoyados por el programa, o bien a realizar estancias en el extranjero. Entonces creo que ese también es un aspecto bastante atractivo. Y bueno, como les comentaba, estas son las sedes, y los temas son ampliamente diversos. Entonces, sin más preámbulo, le cedo la palabra a Octavio para iniciar formalmente con la sesión del día de hoy.
Muchas gracias, Daniel. Bueno, pues el día de hoy precisamente vamos a iniciar que ya las teníamos prendidas y se apagaron. Okay. El día de hoy vamos a iniciar con la presencia del doctor Luis Barbeito. Es para nosotros todo un honor tenerlo aquí en México, pues la gente que ha seguido la historia de las neurociencias en Latinoamérica y en neuroquímica, pues sabrán que él es un referente indiscutible por sus trabajos relacionados con todo lo que tiene que ver con neuroquímica y en los últimos años con los astrocitos, ¿no? El doctor Luis Barbeito nació en Uruguay, él estudió en Francia, ha sido investigador en neuroquímica en el Instituto de Investigaciones Clemente Estable de Uruguay, ha sido profesor de la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad de la República de Uruguay, ha sido jefe del Departamento de Neurobiología Celular y Molecular del Instituto de Investigaciones Biomédicas Clemente Estable de Uruguay, es responsable del Laboratorio de Neurodegeneración del Instituto Pasteur de Montevideo y actualmente es director de esta misma institución, ¿no? Cuenta una cantidad de más de 85 publicaciones indexadas en el PubMed con un factor de H, ha dirigido aproximadamente 15 tesis de maestría y doctorado, y bueno, eso es un breve resumen de todo lo que es el currículum del doctor Barbeito. Y en esta ocasión, pues, va a dar su plática titulada The Pathogenic Role of the Astrocytes in Neurodegenerative Disease, y por lo cual le doy la bienvenida a Luis. Luis, muchas gracias por participar con nosotros.
Bueno, buenos días. Quiero agradecer a Octavio, a Daniel y todos los que me han invitado, la gran cordialidad de los colegas y estudiantes de México, y me siento honrado de estar aquí. Hoy voy a hacer un esfuerzo para hablar en una nueva lengua que lo estoy practicando hace años, que es el Spanglish. Así que espero que todos me van a comprender de un lado y del otro, ¿sí? So I'll switch to Spanglish now. Okay, it's okay. It's okay for you. Okay, so I come from Uruguay, very south in Latin America, and we are building this small institute called Institut Pasteur, which has a branch of neuroscience and inflammation, which I get very much involved. And this is my small research group working hard in different subjects. We also established different collaborations all around Latin America and the rest of the world. So we are very open to work and do research as a network of researchers. So today I won't refer to the basic physiology and functions of glial cells, because I assume that you all know that. And yesterday we had several mentions to the importance of glial cells in general to the physiology of the healthy brain, right? But today we are going to focus in diseases, in neurological diseases, and we are going to understand how astrocyte and perhaps microglia, that most likely they work together many times, and sometimes oligodendrocytes also, as well as immune cells that enter the brain in pathological conditions, contribute to the genesis or progression of neurodegenerative diseases, okay? And I will divide my talk in three different aspects. First is where glia get damaged first, and then it induces the damage of neurons, surrounding neurons, okay? And I call this primary gliopathies, okay? And of course, you will see that most of these primary gliopathies refers to genetic damage of astrocytes or other glial cells that will interfere with the neurodevelopment, okay? Then I will refer to the common view of the contribution of glial cells to neuroinflammation that is associated and contribute to neurodegeneration in most the classical neurodegenerative disease. And the third point is about our contribution concerning the concept that in these pathological processes, there are new kinds of glial cells having aberrant phenotypes that can really contribute to create an autotoxic loop leading to disease progression and neurodegeneration. So I will give few examples about these three subjects. This is an artificial division of the subject, but will help me to show you my talk. Okay, so there are several examples in the literature that when you express mutations that are associated to neurodegenerative disease only in astrocytes, you can produce some pathology. And there are a few of these studies. For example, the expression of mutant huntingtin in mouse models, transgenic mouse models, will cause, as well as happens in Huntington disease, will cause age-dependent damage of striatal neurons. Okay, so that means that and really clarifies that Huntington disease is a non-cell autonomous disease. The mutation must be expressed in neurons, but also when it's expressed in astrocytes, it really contributes to the disease progression. In Parkinson's disease, the synuclein mutations have been also expressed only in astrocytes, and these animals develop some kind of pathologies of the dopaminergic neurons, and this is well demonstrated. Also, the overexpression of the enzyme MAO-B, which produces free radicals because it takes dopamine to produce superoxide and hydrogen peroxide, will also produce a kind of pathology in neighboring dopaminergic neurons. In this case, mediated by the activation of microglia that communicates between the astrocyte and the dopaminergic neurons. So you see that when you touch or you damage the normal physiological function of an astrocyte, of course, its ability to support the normal function and survival of the surrounding neurons will fail. And by many different pathways or mechanisms, including the alteration of the blood-brain barrier, the activation of inflammatory mechanisms involving microglia and immune cells, etc. Okay, so this is clear. But in the primary gliopathies, this is difficult to see in the clinical setup because these are artificial models. But in the clinic, what you see is that the primary gliopathies mostly involve the neurodevelopment. And so mutation of the GFIP will prevent the astrocyte to reach final differentiation, and then you will have a genetic inborn disease that very much damage the normal development of the central nervous system. And in recent years, we have, together with Silvia Oliveira, here from the Institute Clemente Stabile in my country, we have contributed to show that in this disease, that is the glutaric acidemia type 1, where this enzyme, which is a glutaric acid dehydrogenase, is mutated and is not working well. So in the brains, there is an accumulation of glutaric acid, which is very similar to glutamate. So we could demonstrate that glutaric acid accumulated in this disease is taken up by the astrocyte. The astrocytes almost specifically are damaged, and they fail to sustain the normal development. So during the days after birth, you see that there is an astrocyte proliferation in response to glutaric acid, because it produces a mitochondrial failure and inflammatory mechanisms. There is a wave of astrocyte proliferation. Then there is a wave of defective myelination that won't be achieved. And at the end, 3 weeks after the damage, there will be a massive neuronal death that reproduces what is seen in these children that are born with this neurometabolic disease, that they are born completely normal, they develop well during a few months, and in one moment they develop convulsions, what is called an encephalopathic crisis, and they start to do a regression, and they lost all the abilities, and of course they will live for the rest of the life with mental retardation and very important motor disabilities. So this is another example how metabolic conditions were associated because of they like to take up glutamate. Well, they take up glutaric acid, and then they fail to differentiate. They prefer to proliferate instead of differentiate, and then they are not more capable to sustain the normal development. Okay, so now we move to the second mechanism where glial cells are respond to damage, to primary neuronal damage, by getting activated, what we call the reactive astrogliosis or astromicrogliosis or microgliosis, whatever. And this has been seen in many decades ago by pathologists, and of course there is a glial reaction to damage. So in some point there is a big discussion whether this is good or bad for the normal processes. And yesterday we saw how the both sides of the process, the good and the bad, can be observed in a model of brain ischemia, right? So you know that neurodegeneration is in general is a very important issue in public health because it's getting an epidemic profile. Age is the main risk factor. Of course, there is some changes in the associated with age that favor a risk for that. And we know very little about the mechanisms, and there are no effective treatments for prevention or cure these diseases. I'm talking about Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and many others, neurodegenerative disease. But what is common to all of these diseases is that the glial cells respond to the primary damage by getting activated in different ways. It's not homogeneous, this glial activation, and is associated with a concept that is called neuroinflammation, which involves not only the activation of the glial cells, but also changes in vascular physiology and in the invasion of immune cells into the brain parenchyma. So the concept that can be applied to almost all these neurodegenerative disease is that they progress in an ineluctable manner. So once they start, they progress in most of the patients. Mm-hmm. And so during years, this disease can be symptomatically silent. So there is no evidence, for example, that I'm developing Alzheimer's disease, and perhaps in 10 years from now, I will become demented. You never know. So it starts very early, it progresses, and is compensated by the brain. One day it starts, and then it continues to progress. So you see how in this pre-symptomatic stage, then you have this early symptomatic stage, and at the end, the damage that you see in Alzheimer's disease that includes neuronal loss, synapses loss, decrease in the volume of the gray and white matter, and also neuroinflammation. You see how the damage extends from the limbic to the rest of the brain. And then you have progressive symptoms of dementia, characteristic of dementia. So our hypothesis during years is that this disease progression is influenced or by the activity or abnormal activation of the glial cells. So during years in this pre-symptomatic stage, most likely glial cells respond and become activated to compensate and prevent the extension of the damage. But then at one point, the contribution of glial cells is not for the good, but for the bad, and they really make the disease to progress rapidly. This is an hypothesis. It has to be demonstrated. But it's a working hypothesis that is really interesting to follow, because there are many evidence that it works like that. Okay, so in my group, we have studied mainly the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which we have access to a very nice animal model, which is a model of mice and rats that express one mutation related to familial cases of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis that I would refer as ALS. And so in this disease, it's quite simple. I mean, what happens is that motor neurons from the upper motor neurons located in the motor cortex start to degenerate together before, after, or simultaneously to the lower motor neuron that are in the brain stem and the spinal cord and connect directly to the skeletal muscle to allow the movements. So we have about 1 million motor neurons. Lower motor neurons, we have 1 million to control all the movements of the body during the whole life. So, and we have about more than that in the motor cortex. So there are not many neurons. There are big neurons, easily to study. And then in this disease, for some reason that we don't know, they start to degenerate. Not exclusively, other neurons also degenerate, but most of the symptoms are associated to the motor neuron loss. And our model is one model that is not does not explain all the cases, only explain 3 or 4% of ALS cases. Most of the cases are sporadic. 10% are familial, and so they have a genetic basis. And among these familial cases, 10% refer to mutations of this enzyme, which is the superoxide dismutase 1. Okay? And nowadays, after almost 25 years after the discovery, more than 100 different mutations, point mutations, has been identified that are associated to the familial cases of ALS. So, of course, this is a ubiquitous enzyme that is all along the body and is highly expressed in all cell types, including neurons and glial cells. But at this point, when you express mutations, you have almost a specific phenotype that involves the degeneration of motor neurons. So I will just review this after 25 years, we know a lot about how the SOD mutations provide a toxic properties of the nervous system. And so there is a molecular level, at organelle level, cellular level, and systemic level. So only one mutation can make you change the whole system, including the immune system, the energetic metabolism systemically. But the main phenotype is the motor neuron damage and paralysis. And so we have these rat mice models, and we try to understand what's going on and what is the contribution of astrocytes. One important issue or one important step in the understanding of this disease was in 2003, where the Don Cleveland's group demonstrated that the toxicity of the mutant SOD is non-cell autonomous. That means that the motor neurons, the neurons that expressing the mutant enzyme live longer in chimeric mice if they are surrounded by glial cells that do not express the mutation. And so in chimeric mice, you have all kinds of neurons and microenvironments. So they studied one by one, and they showed that a motor neuron that is not expressing the mutation can be damaged if they are surrounded by glial cells that express the mutation. And so this concept opened the mind of many researchers around the world, saying, okay, let's see whether astrocytes and microglia and oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells are contributing to this disease. Okay, and so huge amount of groups in the world have been working on this subject very intensely, but still we don't know everything. So this is a picture from Pamela Shaw Laboratories recent review, where you see a motor neuron in the center, you see astrocytes, you see microglia, and then you see all the different pathological events that have been described in this model. Okay? So for astrocyte, at least, you see that they have an impaired metabolism, they produce less lactate to feed the neurons, they have mitochondrial abnormalities, they have an ability to uptake glutamate by a transporter, they produce increased levels of nitric oxide, which we learned yesterday was very important in the glia neuron interaction, and they also produce more prostaglandin E2. I will refer you that there are other mediators that involves this crosstalk between the astrocyte and the motor neurons, including the overexpression of PC25 receptor for NGF, nerve growth factor. Astrocytes, when they become activated, they like to produce a lot of NGF and nitric oxide together, and they can activate the PC25 receptors and the motor neurons, favorizing the apoptotic triggering. And then microglia also. If you take the animals and you prevent the expression of the mutant SOD microglia, the animals will live longer. The same happens with the motor neurons. With the astrocyte, if you prevent the expression of the enzyme, the animals will live longer. But the disease onset will start exactly at the same time. So the understanding is that these cells are contributing to the disease progression rather to the disease onset. Okay, you got it? Okay. So in 2003, in the same time the chimeric mice was getting published, with Patricia Casina and Mariana Pejar, we did the following experiment. We took cell cultures of spinal cord astrocytes, expressing or not the SOD mutations coming from one animal or another. And after establishing these monolayers, we plated on the top motor neuron, embryonic motor neurons that are isolated by immunopanning methods, so they are quite pure. And then you do the co-cultures where look like that. I mean, motor neurons, they love to be on the top of astrocytes, and they grow very, very well. In few days, you have these pictures of huge, very large motor neurons. And what happens is when you place these motor neurons on the top of the astrocyte that express SOD, the motor neurons are much smaller and they die pretty early after a few days in culture. Okay, and so this is the concept that astrocyte can be toxic for motor neurons. If you do the same experiments, but you do with the hippocampal neurons, nothing will happen. You don't see any effect. And so at this level, our group and many other groups started to understand how astrocyte influence motor neuron survival. And in our side, we published several papers, and in some way we established these mechanisms. And I will go very fast, but this is a motor neuron having several oxidative stress mechanisms inside, and expressing the P75 receptor here in red. And so at that time, we knew that motor neurons could release FGF1, that is very highly expressed in motor neurons. And this will start a kind of inflammation that activate the surrounding astrocytes that are here, that when they express the mutation, they will have an increased signaling through FGF1 receptor, increased release of ATP and P2X7 activation, increased calcium fluxes, and increased glutamine release. And in addition, they produce high levels of NGF, neurofactor, and nitric oxide that can react together to form a nitrated form of NGF called nitro-NGF that is highly neurotoxic by activation of the P75 receptors. So we did that using this co-culture model, and we dissected all these pathways. But when you take an animal and you, for example, immunize the animals with the antibodies to produce antibodies against NGF that go to the brain, well, the disease won't change. And so all these mechanisms happen in vitro, but we have no evidence that happen in vivo. And so we spent many years of research, almost for nothing. But we learned many, many things. And at that time, we started to see that not all astrocytes, whether in the degenerating spinal cord or in culture, were exactly the same. We started to see differences. I mean, the population of astrocytes was not homogeneous. And we started to think in 2005 about the existence that perhaps aberrant cells could emerge from the inflammatory microenvironment, having phenotypes that could become more independent, more aggressive, and eventually could be autotoxic, maintain itself to be more and more toxic to the neurons, and then make the disease to progress rapidly. Because in the rat model, that is the model that we use, the rat, having the mutation, they are absolutely normal during 6 or 7 months. Same weight, same behavior, same motor ability, everything is normal. But in one day, they start to lose weight. 3 days later, they start to gait normally from a hind limb. And 1 week later, they are completely paralytic. And so something happens inside this spinal cord that goes very fast. From 1 day to 10 days, they are completely paralytic, and they lost 20–30% of their weight. And so we became interested to see how were the astrocytes there in this spinal cord. And so my student Pablo started to analyze in culture the population of astrocytes. Normally, the astrocyte we prepare from neonatal animals, as everybody does. But he said, okay, I will do the cultures from these symptomatic rats that are almost dying and see whether I can isolate these putative aberrant glial cells. And so the idea is that to have in these animals, they have still normal astrocytes that do the job of protecting neurons, but coexisting with another population of putative astrocytes that could be really neurotoxic and having an aggressive behavior. And so when he did the experiments, well, everything became clear. So I will come back to this. He established the culture of this aged spinal cord from these symptomatic animals, and he observed almost a beautiful microglia culture. This is a microglia culture, plenty of phagocytic cells, very high, very large cells. But Few days later, they proliferate very actively, and few days later, the monolayer was being created, and 2 weeks later, we had perfect monolayer, indeed, having all the markers for astrocytes. Okay, so that was very difficult to understand and say, okay, let's call it aberrant astrocyte or ABA cells, aberrant astrocytes. And this is the starting point. So to make the story short, these cells can be found in the spinal cord. This is a motor neuron. And so these cells are always surrounding the damaged motor neurons, and they very actively proliferate. This is a co-staining with Ki67, which is a proliferator marker, could be bromodeoxyuridine, and this is S100 beta. That is a classical marker of the disease. You see here dividing, and so these cells are like coming from microglia, but have the morphology in vitro and in vivo of astrocyte. I will tell you some more pictures about this. So in culture conditions, when you have already established the monolayer, these cells express GFAP, S100 beta are the most, you see here, ABAs, they express a lot of S100 beta and few amounts of GFAP, and also they express huge amount of connexin 43. You see here the Western blotting, GFAP, connexin 43. This is primary non-transgenic astrocyte from neonatal animals. We cannot obtain astrocyte from these old animals. This is primary transgenic neonatal astrocyte, and this is ABA cells from the paralytic animals. And you see the huge amount of connexin upregulation, no expression of the glutamate transporter, normal expression of glutamine synthase, and of course, expression of the mutant SLD. This is a toxicity. When you co-culture motor neuron, embryonic motor neurons on the top of this aberrant astrocyte, almost no motor neurons will live. And now we know that this is not permissive, is even not permissive, but they are completely toxic for motor neurons. And when you do the analysis, the toxicity analysis, using the conditioned media of these cell cultures, you see that dilutions up to 1 to 1,000 are toxic for motor neurons in culture. So this is extremely potent, the toxicity, and these ABA cells are the most toxic cells known to kill motor neurons, but they don't kill hippocampal neurons. Okay, they are, as previously described, this is something that is specific for motor neurons. So, what about the identification of this aberrant astrocyte in the spinal cord? So this is still the same picture. I mean, this is the motor neuron, here another one, and you see that the ABA cells co-express GFAP and S100 beta, and they are always located as a large cells, very large cells, surrounding motor neuron. This is a more magnification. You see here several ABA cells in here stained for connexin 43 and S100 beta, and here is stained with GFAP and S100 beta. And so one interesting point that associates these ABA cells to the disease progression is the fact that there are no ABA cells in non-symptomatic animals, but they sharply increase in number as long as the disease starts. They become symptomatic. This is the first few weeks after paralysis onset, and this is at the latest stage. So there is an exponential appearance of these cells during paralysis progression. What about the humans? Human ILS patients do have these ABA cells. This is a big question. We have never published these preliminary results because we have never get access to tissue, good tissue to make a number of observations that could be necessary for publication. So these are 3 patients, and in 3 patients we obtained from Pamela Shaw laboratory 3 sections of the spinal cord from patients, and we observed an increased levels of S100 beta in the ventral horn and also connexin 43, as you see here. And if you do more magnification, we have almost the same picture that in the rat, motor neuron and several cells co-expressing connexin 43 or S100 beta. But few GFIP. GFIP in humans, we haven't observed that until now. But still, we only analyzed 3 patients having the SOD mutations. Then we took these cells and we did the transplantations of these other cells to the spinal cord using micropipettes, okay? And we inject only 12,000 other cells that we know that they proliferate a lot. And then after 2 weeks, we analyze what was going on. And for identify the cells, we use an antibody against the mutant SOD. And so when you wait 2 weeks, okay, this is an hemi spinal cord. This is the other half. And the injection is normally done here, okay, at the side of the central canal. And you see how these cells migrate all along the gray matter, and they displace and kill everything. No motor neuron, nothing is observed. But this that appears in red and covers almost all the gray matter that are microglia, endogenous microglia, stained for lectin tomato. That is this red staining. So this is almost a tumor composed by other cells that we injected previously, together with microglia that is infiltrating the tissue. This is very interesting, and this should be published in a few months. I'm pushing my student to finish it. This is extremely interesting. Here are 2 other cells surrounded by a kind of tumor of microglia that are attracted by the other cells. It's very interesting what is going on here. Okay, we know that this connexin that is also expressed in these other cells forms hemichannels. And Juan Carlos Saez in Chile has done beautiful experiments to show, and I won't enter in the details, to show in vitro that these cells, as compared with the normal neonatal astrocyte, has hemichannels open, and so the dyes can enter easily to the cell, even without any kind of stimulation. So this is very important because the hemichannels, pannexin or connexin hemichannels, you know, that are pro-inflammatory because they lead the release of a